By the afternoon of the 5th of July, 1943, on a stretch of Russian steppe outside a village called Ponyri, more than 30 of the most heavily armored fighting vehicles ever built by any nation on Earth were sitting motionless in a Soviet minefield. So, not one of them had been destroyed by an enemy tank. Their crews were still alive inside. They were sitting in 65 tons of steel. Their armor was so thick that 76-millimeter Soviet anti-tank shells had been bouncing off the front plates all morning. The gun in each of their vehicles could reach out and kill any tank in the world at 3 kilometers. And they could not move. They could not defend themselves. They had no machine guns. And the Soviet infantry knew it. This is the story of a German battalion called Schwere Panzerjägerabteilung 653. It began in a garrison town in Austria in April 1943. And it ended 2 years without prejudice. On a country road in the American zone of occupation with four broken vehicle to men whose fathers, many of you watching this, may have known in between 3 generations of the most powerful tank destroyers of the Second World War came and went beneath them. Ferdinand, Elephant,
Jagdtiger, the Jagdtiger.
The men who rode them died in ways their own engineers had never imagined. This is the horror of the German tank destroyer crew.
All right.
On the 1st of April 19, team. In a garrison town called Bruckender-Leitha, tucked into the Austrian east of Vienna and, without knowing it, sealed the fate of nearly every man in its ranks. Sturmgeschütz Abteilung 197 had spent the war so far as an assault gun unit. Its officers wore the branch color of the artillery. Its men had spent months learning how to keep pace with infantry, how to blast bunkers open, how to survive the small, ugly work of close support.
Now,
in a solemn ceremony on the 14th of April, the senior officer of the assault artillery branch, Oberst Hoffmann Schönborn, said goodbye to them. From that day forward, they would no longer be assault gunners. They would be tank hunters.
Their genus.
Their new designation was Schwere Panzerjägerabteilung 653, and their new commander was a Wehrmacht officer named Major Heinrich Steinwachs. Almost 1,000 men were under his fighting command. Most of them did not yet know what they were going to be fighting in. In May, the machine arrived.
It was called the Ferdinand. After
65 tons of steel, 200 millimeters of armor on the front, the thickest slab of frontal protection any nation had ever put on a fighting vehicle. A high-velocity 88-millimeter PaK-43 that could reach out and punch a hole through a T-34 at 3,000 meters. It sat tall on its tracks like something dragged out of a shipyard. The men who saw it for the first time went quiet. 90 of these vehicles existed in the entire world. Roughly half went to Battalion 653.
The
other half went to their sister unit, Battalion 6. They formed to their sister unit. Together they Schwere's 656 Panther Regiments of Gesluchten was Lieutenant Baron Ernst von Jungenfeld. The Ferdinand had one problem that no one wanted to talk about too loudly. It had no defensive machine gun.
Not one.
If enemy infantry came on, Trensis?
Chaps. Hayes.
The Schrenstischekon?
Hey.
To fight them off, the truth. 6, except the pistols on belts. They trained through May and June in Austria, billeted in the old Hungarian Hussar barracks at Neusiedl am See.
They practiced with the machine, learned its quirks, wrote down its failures.
The gasoline-electric drivetrain. A hybrid system where the engines powered electric generators, which powered electric motors, which turned the tracks, overheated in warm weather. The final drive strained. The transmission was fragile. This every time psych it. The vibration fired its main gun devices of the recoil could knock the gun's aiming devices out of alignment. A senior technical sergeant named Brunthalter wrote a detailed report about it. He handed it to the battalion commander and asked that it be forwarded up the chain.
Dame got Chinese.
Whether it ever got read, no one knows. They were sent to Russia. On the 30th of that month, the three companies of Battalion 603 were sitting in assembly areas outside them had ever heard of.
Davidovo. Gostanovo.
Kuliki.
On the 1st of July, the whole of 9th Army began to move. Junel.
On the 2nd of July, they moved 15 kilometers closer to the front. On the evening of the 3rd of July, under a bruised summer sky, the Ferdinands of Battalion 653 rolled into their start positions in the town of Glasunovka, right on the Ural to Kursk railway line. The next evening, the 4th of July, Baron von Jungenfeld addressed his men.
Riss?
Whatever he said, the complete form. Tis only the memory that he spoke, that the men listened, and that in the morning they would attack the northern face of a Soviet defensive belt built in depth, the deepest belt of defenses ever prepared for a battle in history. At dawn on the 5th of July, the German Toaster artillery opened fire.
Bound or out. For a few nans moved ord. Hours.
It looked like a miracle weapon had come. Soviet gunners crewing the Z-370.2 millimeter anti-tank guns, the standard divisional gun of the Red Army rounds, strike the front plates of the Ferdinands and simply bounce off. Not deflect, not spall. Bounce. 200 millimeters of rolled steel was more than double what a Z-3 could penetrate at any range. The Soviet guns were firing into an oncoming wall. The men crewing those guns were about to be killed by shells launched from vehicles they could not hurt. But the Soviets had done something the Germans had not planned for. They had buried mines.
Everywhere.
In belts kilometers deep. Between the belts of mines, they had dug anti-tank ditches. Between the ditches, they had positioned dug-in tanks and camouflaged pack-front gun batteries. The whole northern face of the Kursk salient was a single monstrous kill zone, 8 kilometers thick.
Verdnesmol, Herrn Winsetcher, though, Virors, close, infantry support.
There were reasons for this. Some tactical, some ideological, most inexcusable. The result, machines drove forward into a minefield with no one walking ahead of them to find the mines first. They found them the only way they could.
The first Ferdinand struck a mine and lost a track.
And slight. It sat there, immobile, its cannon still functional, the crew still alongside, inside, while the vehicles around it kept moving. Another Ferdinand hit a mine, then another, then another.
Rednub.
The wizen like it or doesn't, the leading companies, our Bleevings train, stopped Veggerets, started across the Russians. He stemma dips like broken teeth. Some, the Maybach power plants, straining under the impossible weight. Some had blown transmissions. Some just stopped, and nobody could say why.
Lay.
Written on aim. By 1700 hours on the 5th of July, that is, by 5 in the afternoon on the first day, only 12 Ferdinands of Sectalia 3 were still operational. 12. They had begun the morning with 45, and they had barely faced any actual Soviet tanks yet. Steinwachs kept pushing. His orders were to keep pushing. Over the 6th and 7th of Julasan, took part in the vicious, close-in fighting for a village called Ponyri, a railway line into a fortress that had been turned into a station. Around Ponyri, the Ferdinands crawled forward at walking pace across ground that was now a mixture of rubble, mines, and bodies.
Sergeant Ebet.
Fine one,
Et
with an intensity that Soviet defenders fought with in German officers, and a close at even from cellars and shell craters.
sirs,
Self-tank guns fired at Ferdinand guns dueled with the Ferdinands at ranges under 1,000 meters. And here, in the streets of Pony, the third problem of the Ferdinand became real.
Niger, geez.
Without a machine gun, Soviet trained in special assault groups for exactly this kind of urban fighting, began to close in on individual Ferdinands where they were slowed or stopped.
Dirty says, prejudice. Record corsets, one's sub-battalion show during the Kursk.
Battles to a close in infantry attack. Only one, not because the tactic could not work, but because the situation of a Ferdinand pinned in a Soviet street was still rare. The bigger killers, by far, were the mines, the anti-tank guns, and the machines themselves.
But that one loss haunted the men.
They talked about it. They knew the machine they were sitting in had been sent to war without a way to keep infantry off it. They knew,
Jernup,
in that moment, that the Thithmia designed and had never intended for it to be used the way it was being used. Steinwachs ordered a maintenance day. He had no choice. Every vehicle in the battalion was on the edge of mechanical failure. The Soviet counteroffensive began at Oferel on the 11th of July. The 3rd Soviet Tank Army, 4 corps, 21 divisions, 1,460 tanks, 230,000 men,
Jep,
was rolling straight at the exhausted units of the German 9th Army.
Jira,
Battalion 650-3 was ordered on the night of the 13th to shift into a defensive sector under a general named Rendulic. The Ferdinands, which had been designed as long-range killers, were now being asked to do the exact opposite job of what they had been built for. They were being asked to plug holes.
Joles,
On the 24th of July, Steinwachs sat down and wrote a status report to the headquarters of the 2nd Panzer Army. He had 45 Ferdinands on his rolls. 25 were operational. 25. Of those 25, he wrote, the vehicles were auf dem letzten Loch, on their last legs. He recommended that his battalion be pulled out of the line.
Jirges,
Popter Akancher Sigzetztes, and its vehicles dispersed to maintenance units a few kilometers behind the front, kept in small mobile reserves a few kilometers behind the front, and fed back into combat only when absolutely necessary. The High Command did not agree.
breaking. The horror of the tank destroyer crew had begun.
And the men lived through it. The ones who would still be alive at the end of that summer would never again think of the Ferdinand as a miracle weapon. They would think of it as the machine that had been sent to Russia to die.
Jolay,
And what they did not yet know, plumb sitting in the wreckage in the last days of July, doesn't the Kursk battlefield in the last days of July, was that the survivors would not go home. The survivors would be pulled back to Austria, where the machines would be rebuilt into something new, and then they would be sent to a place that would prove worse than Russia.
done it?
Amazdirabinzer, Prangeles, a place with olive trees and stone bridges built by the Romans with the sound of American aircraft engines. But that comes later. For now, on the 24th of July 1943, a major named Heinrich Steinwachs finished his report, signed his name, and handed it to a runner.
The report wort. Reached headquarters. The High Command read it. Through?
They kept the battalion into the first weeks of autumn. Through August and into the first weeks of autumn, the Ferdinands of Battalion 53 fought a war they had never been designed to fight. They were pulled from one crisis to the next along the collapsing southern shoulder of the Kursk salient, thrown into defensive actions around Nikopol, along the Dnieper bend, Wherever the front cracked and something big and armored was needed to plug the hole. The vehicles broke down and were dragged back.
They were patched together and sent forward.
Then broke down again. Somewhere in the middle of August, Steinwachs was quietly moved out. His replacement was another major, de Staliones, a man named Georgor Baumunk, who inherited what was left of the battalion and the impossible job of keeping it in the field. The men noticed the change. In an army that was losing, changes of command were common enough. That they no longer meant much was that the vehicles were dying. What mattered was that the vehicles were faster than they could be replaced, and the men inside them were dying with them. By the end of the year, the decisions had been made at the highest levels of the German.
Surviving Ferdinands.
The surviving Ferdinands were pulled out of Russia entirely. And every wreck that could still be salvaged is loaded on flat-bed rail cars
and shipped west, back through Poland, back through Slovakia, back to the country where the story had started, back to Austria.
They arrived at the Nibelungenwerk in St.
Valentin,
a factory owned by the Steyr-Daimler Puch Works, in the early weeks of 1944. There the vehicles were stripped down to the hull. Engineers and factory workers, some of them women, some of them foreign forced laborers, went over every plate, every weld, every strained piece of running gear.
Gletscher.
What they built back up was not the same machine.
The ledge Cheji, so pace, so theta.
Borrowed from the design of the Stugy 3, with Severpansko so the Condor block so the commander could see out without opening the hatch. A hull machine gun was mounted in the front plate for the radio operator. Every crew that had survived Kursk had been asking for this machine gun for 6 months.
Now, finally, they had it.
An extra plate of 30mm armor was welded across the lower front hull to give better protection against mines and low-angle hits. And across the entire vehicle, a strange, ridged coating was troweled on. This was called Zimmerit.
Ratchet.
It was a paste of barium sulfate, and sawdust and pine stipku designed to keep magnetic mines from sticking to the armor. The vehicles came out of the factory bulkier, tougher, more finished. And on the 1st of May 1944, an order came down from the German Army High Command that the name Teen would change.
Jettison, a Jene. Oh, day. It would be called, Elephant.
The name suited it. It was heavy, slow, and prehistoric. But before the order officially changed the name, something more urgent had already happened.
Dalechen. Done.
On the 22nd of January 1944, the Allies had landed at Anzio and Nettuno, 30 miles south of Rome. Nobody had expected it. The German defensive line, further south at Monte Cassino, was suddenly in danger of being cut off from behind. The German High Command needed to throw everything they had into containing the beachhead before it could break out. The overhaul at the Nibelungenwerk was still underway. The first 11 vehicles were finished in a rush, and on the 15th of February, 1944, the same day, those 11 Elephantses were officially issued to the 1st Company of Battalion 653. A new commander arrived to take over the entire battalion. His name was Rudolf Grillenberger. He was 30 years old, born on the 21st of March, 1914, in a Germany that no longer existed.
Dutch.
He was not a tank man. He had spent the war so far as an infantry officer, a company commander in Grenadier Regiment 3 and Grenadier Regiment 15, then Grenadier Regiment 19, an instructor at the infantry school, He had never commanded armor. He had never fought inside a fighting vehicle.
And now he was being a heavy tank destroyer battalion.
equipped with the strangest battalion, equipped the strangest, heaviest, most temperamental machines in the entire German inventory, at exactly the moment those machines were being sent to the worst possible terrain in Europe to fight them on. He had one day.
Barachus.
On the 16th of February, the 1st Company of Battalion Sig 53 loaded 11 Elephants, 1 Bergepanzer recovery vehicle, and 2 Panzer III ammunition carriers onto rail cars and started the journey south to Italy. They arrived in the Anzio-Nettuno sector in the last days of February.
Ja, well,
Pins on the 29th
of report noted.
That's all 11 elephants were operational. They were attached to the LX-1 Panzer Corps, assembled at Genzano near Castel Gandolfo in the Alban Hills south of Rome, and told they would be fighting alongside a Luftwaffe parachute division, Hermann Göring, called Hermann Göring.
Then,
the terrain began to kill them. Italy was not Russia. In Russia, the Ferdinand had died in minefields on the open steppe. In Italy, the Éclairant would die in ways that no engineer at the Nibelungenwerk had ever imagined. Italy was mountains. Italy was olive groves clinging to hillsides.
Joe.
Italy was villages built atop prejudice. Italy was built of stone I roam on the tops of ridges, connected by roads that had been laid down by Roman engineers 2,000 before the internal combustion engine had been invented. Bridges were the problem. An elephant weighed nearly 70 tons. A Roman-era stone bridge, a medieval bridge, was designed to carry ox carts and horse teams. A modern Italian country bridge could carry maybe 20 tons. A Sherman tank weighed around 30 tons, and Sherman and even Shermans regularly broke through Italian bridges.
Gillette.
An elephant at 70 tons of almost every crossing on the peninsula, and the Allies had blown many of the bridges before withdrawing. So the Germans, coming forward to reinforce, arrived at rivers with no way across. The engineers built temporary crossings out of pontoons and heavy timber.
John Dolan. On. Crawl. Oh. John.
On the 1st of March 1944, near a small village called Isolas Bella, an elephant was ordered to turn around. Its commander was a man whose last name has come down through the battalion's records as Cool.
Drisher Echo. Giso.
The bridge ahead of him had been destroyed. His vehicle was too heavy to ford the ditch below it. He was trying to reverse and pivot on the narrow road, and the ground gave way. Jacks or something in the drivetrain finally broke.
The Elef was lost. Not to enemy fire, not to a Sherman. Not to Jestens.
Lost to a road that had never been built to carry it. In the same area, another Elephant, commanded by a man named Koss, drove over a mine. The damage was severe enough that the crew was ordered to destroy it. Another, commanded by a man named Roos, it could not be recovered. It was abandoned. Another one caught fire in the engine bay and burned. All of this happened in the same small stretch of terrain, in the same handful of days, without any of these vehicles ever facing an American tank. By the end of April, the 1st Company had already lost about half of the vehicles it had brought to Italy. Not one of them had been killed by a tank. But then came the Elephants that did fight and did work. Through March and April and into May 1944, the front line around Anzio settled into a stalemate. The Elephants that were still running dug in behind the defensive lines.
That fun.
They found positions along ridges and Canlidge
to Letter.
To behind some farmhouses. Positions where the 200mm frontal armor faced forward, and the vulnerable sides and rear. From those positions they hunt, The 88 millipack 40 itself was still the finest anti-tank gun in the war.
Gillets?
From a well-chosen firing position, an Elephant could reach out and a merry 1,000-meter Sherman. Then the Sherman could shoot back with anything that would matter. The crews on the Sherman could shoot back with anything Shermans. They killed Battalion Stuart light tanks. 6
30s Ledchurch.
They killed British-built vehicles operating in American units. The kill counts, if you believe the German after-action reports, were impressive. And it did not matter. Because on the 23rd of May, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Buffalo. The breakout from Anzio began.
BIP.
The Fifth Army pushed north up the Via Appia, the 2,000-year-old Roman road that ran from Anzio through the town of Cisterna toward the Alban Hills, and Rome beyond. The 1st Company of Battalion 653, or what was left of it, had 9 Elephants still operational.
Ventrea?
They were positioned 2 kilometers behind the front lines, in prepared firing positions along the Via Appia. Elephant number or near was Nairn, Cisterna itself. Their guns worked. When American tanks pushed up the road, the Elephants killed them. But the Americans did not just send tanks. They sent the 3rd Infantry Division, 3 regiments abreast, the 30th, the 7th, the 15th, supported by the 751st Tank Battalion, and the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion. They sent their artillery. They sent, above all, their Air Force. On the 24th and 25th of May, American fighter bombers came in wave after wave. The Elephants had never been designed to survive from the air. They had thin roof armor, thick side armor, thick front armor. What they had over their heads was a plate of steel just barely enough to keep out shrapnel.
Dunshit?
A Flun a P-47. Thunderbolt, coming down out of the sun with a bomb slung under its belly and 850 caliber machine guns howling, could kill an Elephant just by getting close. The crews began to abandon their vehicles. Some Elephants pulled back before they were caught. Others were disabled where they sat torched by their own men.
That.
The town of Cisterna fell to the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division on the morning. Number 102 was captured intact. The Americans found it. They photographed it. They studied it. They eventually put it on a boat, sent it home, and put it on display in a museum in the United States.
7 Ledgers.
7 decades later, that same Elephant would sit in a Chelsnate of Georgia, a piece of German engineering and soldiers. Surlevered to Americans Creens Tellner Status in a Mainstension Sonelli to walk house past it and read its plaque, and quietly, about what its crew must have felt in the moment they walked away from it. On the 5th of June, 1944, the last full day before the Normandy invasion changed everything about the war, an Elephant of Battalion 53 was destroyed in Italy by American dive bomber attack. Not by a tank. From above. By the 21st of June, 3 Elephants and the recovery vehicle were all that remained operational in the 1st Company.
Through the summer,
the survivors withdrew north.
Fought.
Delaying actions, they broke down. They were abandoned. On the 2nd of August, 1944,
Jetch.
What was left of the company reached the town of Piadina, on the plain of northern Italy. And the vehicles were loaded onto rail cars and sent to Vienna for repair. There were not many of them. The men who came off those trains had been through Kursk and had been through Italy. Some of them had watched 3 different machines fail underneath them in less than a year. They had watched their commanders come and go.
Barrel.
They had learned that thick armor did not save you from a bridge, that a good gun did not save you frontal plate. Did WW2 save you from a bomb dropped by a pilot you never saw? They were sent to a training area at Dollersheim, deep in the Austrian area at Dollersheim. It was quiet there. It was safe.
Sorry, Team Genesis.
And through the last weeks of the summer of 1944, they waited for whatever was coming next. What was coming next arrived in October the 1st. 12 vehicles of a new design were driven onto the training grounds at Dollersheim. Some of the men of Battalion 653 were sent directly to the Nibelungenwerk to help assemble the machines coming off the line, so that when they finally sat inside them in combat, they would know exactly what had been welded and bolted and wired into the metal around them. The new machine was called Jagdtiger. It weighed 75 tons.
Nice. I carried it to 100 heavy anti-aircraft aircraft weapon.
Its frontal armor was 250 millimeters thick, sloped, the heaviest piece of armor plate ever mounted on a fighting vehicle in the Second World War. And the very first thing the men were told when they began their training on it was this: the main gun had a travel lock. That travel lock could only be released from outside the vehicle. If they encountered the enemy unexpectedly while moving, one of them would have to climb out into whatever fire the enemy was putting down on them, walk to the front of the vehicle, and unlock the gun by hand, fought, before they could fire back. Rudolf Grillenberger, 30 years old, was still their commander. Wathier, he had been the man in charge when the Elephants had failed in Italy. He had watched his companies get chewed up on Italian roads, on Italian bridges, under Italian skies, and now he was being handed the heaviest fighting vehicle ever built. He had 8 weeks to make his battalion ready for combat.
The war was already lost.
Every officer in the German army knew it,
whether they said it out loud or not.
And the vehicles being unloaded onto the training grounds at Dollersheim were about to give Battalion 653 one final act.
Better.
A last terrible chapter in a carnism. A last terrible chapter in a story that had begun almost 2 years earlier in the same country, when a battalion of assault gunners had been told they would be tank hunter. Now, by the middle of December 1944, the training at Dollersheim was over. It had never really been finished. There had not been enough fuel to run the vehicles the way the crews needed to run them. There had not been enough spare parts. There had not been enough time. But the German army no longer had time to give. On the 16th of December, in the Ardennes forest, hundreds of kilometers to the west, the last great German offensive of the war began.
Gerditch? They tried. Battalion 653 was ordered to join it. They tried.
The Jagdtigers were loaded onto rail cars and moved
west.
They arrived late. By the 23rd of December, 4 Jagdtigers of the 3rd Company, under an officer named Franz Kretschmer, were positioned near a Luxembourg town called Schaumont.
But Angel Letcher?
I'm then now without prejudice. They were meant to follow the elite Panzer Lehr division on its drive towards St. Hubert. But orders came. Then counter-orders fired a shot. They were pulled back. The Ardennes offensive shot collapsed while Battalion 653 was still trying to catch up to it. Grillenberger was ordered south.
Gillage?
Anyone his since to teams. His battalion at the Americans in Operation Position Lorraine, his meant to catch while offensive aimed at to catch what was left of the U.S. 7th Army in the flank. On the first day of Nordwind, Grillenberger had only a handful of Jagdtigers available. Just 3 of them were operational.
They surge?
Doesn't like it. The rest were broken down along those in the assembly areas, waiting for tow trucks that would never come, for spare parts that no longer existed. 75-ton vehicles do not simply wait. Their tracks rust. Their crews sit next to them and watch the war go by. On the 9th of January, 1945, 3 Jagdtigers of the 1st Company moved into position near a small French town called Rimling in Lorraine, close to the German borders. They were supporting the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, one of the Jagdtigers. Tactical, and I'm sure we ran in 34, took up an overwatch position on a slope outside the town.
So say, der so, Jad, der so.
Somewhere in the American lines, a soldier picked up a bazooka, not penetrate the front of a bazooka. The bazooka round could not penetrate front of Jadabur was 250 millimeter. Frontal armor was proof against every anti-tank weapon in the American arsenal. What the bazooka could the armor was penetrate was the side,
Direction at Stromiger Dutch.
where the ammunition rack was mounted. It went through the side plate. Ice struck the ammunition. The inside of the Jagdtiger flashed white. The entire crew was killed. 250 millimeters of frontal armor. And it did not matter. It had never mattered. The horror of the Jagdtiger was not that it was weak.
Der ist her name.
Than its white strength, its
It's
came from every direction at once. The 2 other Jagdtigers watched what happened to number 134 and withdrew. Grillenberger kept fighting. On the 23rd of January, after weeks of scraping his battalion together, he finally had his full authorized strength of 42 Jagdtigers, backed by 6 anti-aircraft vehicles. Somebody in the German High Command must have looked at the number and felt something like satisfaction.
der any chair.
42 of the heaviest fighting vehicles ever built concentrated in one unit on one front. 1 week later, after a road march of about 200 kilometers to a new sector, 20 of them were gone, not destroyed by American guns, not knocked out by aircraft, broken, sitting on the side of the road with cracked final drives, blown transmissions, seized engines, the 75-ton weight, the untested drivetrain, the exhausted mechanics. All of it caught up with the battalion in the space of about 6 days. Grillenberger had 22 operational Jagdtigers left.
Through Mathray.
February, there was almost no fuel, and almost no Tigers were used as improvised long ranges, firing indirect fire from fin-range artillery, throwing indirect fire from concealed positions, throwing .28 millimeter shells over ridges, at targets the crews could not see. In March, the fighting picked back up.
A. Sherman was destroyed. Buncher.
A few Allied bunkers, some of them
Reoccupied?
Maginot Line positions, were silenced by direct fire from the big guns. Small victories in a war whose ending had already been written, and then, on the 26th of March 1945, an order came down from OKH that must have arrived like a slap.
Chap.
Major Rudolf Grillenberger, 31 years old, commander of Schwere Panzerjäger Abteilung 653 for over a year, the man who had led the battalion through the disaster in Italy, through the transition to the Jagdtiger, through the failed Ardennes deployment, through Nordwind, through the road march that broke 20 of his vehicles, was relieved of his command.
Geometers.
He was demoted, not by 1 grade. He was reduced from major to Leutnant zur Verfügung, a lieutenant on standby without a real command. The reason given in the language of the Nazi regime was tactical failure. He was sent to Panzer Abteilung 507 as a platoon leader, containing the most powerful fighting vehicles station on the battlefield, was taken from him. He was given a platoon. A new commander was appointed on the 15th of April. Major Rolf Fromm. He had less than a month. Through April, Fromm's battalion fought a running retreat back through southern Germany. Nordheim.
Ludwigsburg. Kreilsheim. Nürnberg.
Each town, a name that older Evils watchers might remember from newsreels or from their own father's war stories, the names of places where the American 7th Army and the French 1st Army were closing the last gap on the Third Reich. The Jagdtigers, when they still had fuel, dueled with Shermans in fields outside German villages. When they ran out of fuel, and that happened more and more often as April went on, the crews rigged demolition charges. A demolition charge shoved down the barrel of the 128mm gun. A detonator. A fuse. A running man. A muffled thump. And another Jagdtiger became scrap metal in a German ditch, killed by its own crew to prevent capture. Roughly 1 out of every 3 Jagdtigers of Battalion 653 was lost to enemy fire. The other 2 out of 3 were destroyed by their own men or abandoned when they broke down.
That is the number that ends the story of the Jagdtiger. Not a battlefield loss ratio.
By the beginning of May 1945, Frommy's battalion had retreated southeast towards Austria, back toward the country where the whole story had begun.
Bruck an der Leitha,
where Steinwachs had taken command in April 1943, was less than 200 kilometers to Schied. The men were kilometers to the east. On the 5th of May 1945, elements of Battalion 653 surrendered to American forces at a village called Strengberg in Lower Austria. 4 Jagdtigers were still operational. Only 4.
Jet.
Out of the 70 or 80 vehicles that the Nibelungen work had ever built, from every unit that had ever used them, this was what remained of the front-line strength in this sector. 4 vehicles, handed over intact to a company of American infantry that had probably never seen anything like them.
The rest of the battalion capitulated on the 8th of May. Czechs. Chapter.
The war in Europe was over. The men were marched into prisoner of war compounds. Some of them had been with the battalion since Bruck an der Leitha in April 1943. 2 full years. They had fought at Kursk. They had fought in Italy.
Milt.
In Alsace. Cross the collapsing in Alsace. They had watched 3 generations of tank, destroyer, come and go beneath them. Ferdinand, Elephant, Jagdtiger. They had watched the war of movement give way to the war of retreat.
War of retreat
give way to demolition charges shoved down the barrels of their own guns.
And what had it been for?
Survived the war. He had been born on the 21st of March 1914. He had turned 31 only 5 days before he was demoted. He went home, whatever home was left.
Demotion order that
had reduced him to a lieutenant, filed away in a Wehrmacht personnel folder that would eventually be captured, catalogued, and studied by military historians, followed him for the rest of his life.
Zunders? On
The Moinem on a prejudice. Heinrich Steinwachs read reports from Kursk saying his vehicles were on their last legs, disappears from the historical record after 1943. Georg Baumunk, who took over in the aftermath, disappears as well. Rolf Frummy, the last commander, signed the surrender at Strengberg.
Baron Ernst von Jungenfeld.
Johanst, the regimental commander, who had spoken to the men on the evening of the 4th of July 1943, before Kursk began, had commanded the regiment as it disintegrated, company by company, across a year and a half of retreat. Whatever he had said to his men that summer evening in Russia, none of it was ever written down.
Jet.
Milenev right now without prejudice. His speech, like most of what those men saw and did, exists now only in the negative space of the historical record. The words are gone. Only the fact that they were spoken remains. The men who lived through it went back to Germany, back to a country that had been broken. Most of them did not talk about the war. Not to their wives.
not to their sons, not to their grandsons.
There is a reason that so much of what we know about Battalion 653 comes from the dry official pages of after-action reports and status returns and personnel files, and so little of it comes from personal memoirs. The men did not want to be asked. They had ridden the most fearsome fighting vehicles their country ever built into the worst battlefields of the Second World War. They had watched those vehicles. They had watched their commanders come and go, and, in the case of the last one, be broken down and demoted for the crime of losing a war that was never winnable. They had climbed out in the last days and set explosives against their own guns and walked away. The horror of the German tank destroyer crew was not really about the enemy. The horror was about the machine. The horror was about what happens when a government builds you a weapon.
Tells ship.
It is the finest in the world, ships you into a war it is already losing, and leaves you sitting in 75 tons of steel on a country road in southern legends, coming closer through the engines, coming closer through the trees.
Joe Lachette.
Number 102 sits today in a museum, the American state of Georgia. In a museum in the American state of Georgia, every year some Americans walk past it and read the plaque and think about the men who once rode inside it. Most of them do not know the name of the battalion. Most of them do not know the name Grillenberger. Most of them do not know that on a spring morning in 1945, near a village in Austria, 4 Jagdtigers were handed over to a company of American infantry. Vile a story that had begun without begun.
Way.
And they did not